Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Think about the sheer physical challenge of feeding 1 million people every single day.
Yeah, it's a massive undertaking.
Right, and there is no electricity. There are no diesel-powered trains hauling freight across the continent. There is no refrigeration to keep perishables from rotting.
Nothing.
You just have to try to accomplish this using only wooden sailing ships, ox-drawn carts, and human muscle. And the stakes are as high as they get.
Oh, absolutely. If you succeed in this logistical feat, you secure the loyalty of the most powerful city on Earth and effectively rule the known world.
But if you fail, like if the shipments are delayed by even just a few weeks, the city starves.
Yeah.
And the citizens will quite literally burn your authority to the ground.
Yeah, the mob is not forgiving when it comes to food.
So today we are taking a deep dive into the Cura Annonae, which is this vast, intricate logistics system that procured, transported, stored, and distributed grain for the ancient city of Rome.
And we're drawing from some really detailed sources for this. We're looking at academic papers on imperial statecraft, detailed analyses of Roman maritime logistics, and, historical records chronicling that turbulent shift from the Roman Republic to the empire.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are talking about sustaining an immense urban population in antiquity. But before we get into the political warfare that surrounded this food supply, let us establish the baseline. Like, what are the sheer caloric mechanics of keeping 1 million Romans alive?
Well, the caloric reality is really foundational to understanding every political and economic decision the Roman state made regarding its food supply. Feeding a city of 1 million people in the pre-industrial age, that was a logistical hurdle unmatched until the 19th century railway era.
Right, it's a problem of pure volume and distance, too.
Exactly. Now, the overarching term we use for this entire system is the annona. But in the sources, annona actually has a few overlapping meanings that we need to keep distinct.
Okay, what are they?
Primarily, it represents the physical grain supply of the city itself, the actual physical wheat. Secondly, it refers to the massive administrative bureaucracy that developed to manage that supply.
So the administration and the grain itself share the name.
Right. And then later in Roman history, this concept was personified and deified as the goddess Annona. She was a divine figure who represented imperial provision and the prosperity of the state.
Right, and when we look at the raw numbers of that provision, the scale becomes really difficult to conceptualize. Because by the 2nd century, Rome's population hit that 1 million mark.
Yeah.
But the frumentatio, which is the actual state grain goal, it was not given to every single person in the city, was it?
No, not at all. The sources indicate it was distributed to approximately 200,000 adult male citizens.
200,000. And how much did they actually get?
Well, the state distributed this grain using a standard Roman dry measure called the modius. A single modius is roughly 8.5 liters of volume.
Okay, so a decent-sized bucket.
Yeah, and when you fill a vessel of that size with wheat, it translates to roughly 6 to 7 kilograms, depending on the moisture content in the specific cultivar of the grain.
Got it.
And the established monthly allotment for an eligible citizen was 5 modii.
So wait, if a citizen is receiving 5 modii every month, they are walking away with roughly 30 to 35 kilograms of raw, unground wheat. That is a substantial physical weight for one person to just carry through the streets of Rome 12 times a year.
It's a considerable burden, yeah. And that is just for one individual. When you multiply that individual 35-kilogram allotment by the 200,000 eligible recipients on the state rolls...
Which is the cap.
Right, the total volume required by the state reaches over 20 million modii annually. That is just to sustain the free dole.
Just for the dole, not even the open market.
Exactly. In modern terms, we are looking at approximately 135,000 metric tons of grain that had to be moved into the city every single year without fail.
I mean, to put that 135,000 metric tons into a physical perspective, you can look at the Roman supply chain almost like a massive empire-spanning aqueduct.
That's a good way to look at it.
But instead of water flowing steadily downhill driven by gravity, this aqueduct requires the relentless manual movement of hundreds of thousands of heavy sacks of wheat across unpredictable, dangerous seas.
Right. It required fleets of hundreds of ships constantly in motion just to keep the city's baseline caloric needs met.
Now, looking at this massive expenditure of state resources, I have to address the listener here. You might be wondering, why provide this for free? Was this an ancient form of modern welfare?
That's a really common misconception, but the sources make a very clear distinction on that exact point. The Roman dole was heavily restricted.
So not a charity.
Absolutely not a universal charity, no. Nor was it a social safety net designed to eradicate poverty in the modern sense. It was a specific, exclusive privilege of male Roman citizenship.
Which means it's tied to status.
Yes. This privilege was deeply tied to a long history of landholding in Italy, and it served as a form of civic compensation or, recognition for military service.
So it was essentially a benefit of belonging to the club of Roman citizens.
Exactly. It was strictly for citizens who resided in Rome and whose names appeared on the official state rolls, known as the album.
What if you weren't on the list?
If you were an immigrant, a slave, a freedman who didn't meet specific criteria, or simply a citizen passing through, you did not have access to this grain. The state audited the album carefully. It was a rigid system of civic entitlement, not a charitable endeavor based on financial need.
That distinction is crucial. But to understand how this massive, highly restricted logistical machine became a permanent fixture of the Roman state, we have to look back at the political chaos of the late Republic. The sources indicate that this is where wheat first really became weaponized in the political arena.
Yeah, weaponized is the perfect word for it.
How did the Republic initially handle the food supply before the emperors took over?
So, the chronological origins of the formal system begin during a period of immense social upheaval in the Republic. In 123 BCE, the politician Gaius Gracchus passed the Lex Sempronia Frumentaria.
Okay, the first grain law.
Right. But it is important to note that this initial law did not give grain away for free. Rather, it offered a subsidized ration of grain to citizens at a fixed price of 6 1/3 asses per modius.
So they still had to pay something.
Yes. The goal was to guarantee affordability for the urban citizens during times of severe market fluctuation, which were becoming increasingly common at that time.
But why were those market fluctuations happening in the first place? Why couldn't the citizens just buy food normally in 123 BCE?
Well, it stems from a structural crisis in Italian agriculture. The constant wars of the Republic meant that citizen farmers were away on military campaigns for years at a time.
Right, fighting overseas.
Exactly. And while they were gone, wealthy elites bought up their land, creating massive slave-worked estates known as latifundia.
So the small farmers just lost their livelihoods.
Yeah. When the veterans returned, they were landless and flocked to the city of Rome, which swelled the urban population. At the same time, these large estates shifted away from growing subsistence grain and moved toward more profitable cash crops.
So less grain being grown locally, but way more people needing to eat it.
Precisely. So you have a rapidly growing urban population entirely dependent on a shrinking local grain supply. The market prices became highly volatile, leading to widespread hunger and unrest. Gracchus's law was an attempt to stabilize that volatility.
But the subsidized price did not last, did it? Because the political leverage of food was just too tempting.
Right, it was too powerful a tool. The major escalation occurs in 58 BCE. Another politician, Clodius Pulcher, passes a law making the state grain entirely free for all eligible citizens.
He just zeroed out the cost.
He removed the subsidized price entirely. And by doing this, the recipient list swells dramatically, reaching around 320,000 people.
Which is way higher than that 200,000 cap we talked about later.
Oh, yeah. This created an immediate, massive strain on the treasury and the physical logistics system, leading to a severe supply crisis just a year later.
That seems like an incredibly reckless piece of legislation. It sounds less like economic policy and more like a hostile takeover of the populace.
Well, it certainly created chaos. In 57 BCE, the situation became so dire that the Senate was forced to act drastically. Pompey the Great was granted an extraordinary 5-year Cura Annonae.
A special commission.
Right, a special commission with sweeping proconsular power just to fix the grain shortages and prevent mass starvation. That progression from Gracchus to Clodius to Pompey highlights how the grain dole evolved into a primary tool of what is known as popularis politics.
Okay, let's break down that term for a moment. Popularis politics essentially relied on bypassing the traditional conservative authority of the Senate by appealing directly to the massive voting blocs in the popular assemblies, right?
Exactly. Ambitious politicians used the distribution of state grain to cultivate vast clientelist networks. It was a complex system of patronage.
So trading food for power.
Yeah, they were trading food security for political loyalty and votes. If a politician championed free grain, the urban voters would guarantee his election to powerful magistracies.
It sounds like an ancient political patronage racket. The politician says, You vote for my faction in the assembly, and I make sure your family has bread this winter.
That was the dynamic, yes.
But looking at the sources, there seem to be two very different historical interpretations of these legislative acts. We should lay them both out clearly for the listener so we're seeing the whole picture.
The historiography is definitely split. One view frames these laws, particularly those of Gracchus, as necessary pragmatic relief.
Okay, so the empathetic view.
Right. This perspective argues that the dispossessed citizen farmers were suffering from rampant inflation and systemic inequality, and the state had a fundamental obligation to ensure its citizens did not starve in the streets of their own capital.
And the opposing view.
The other view frames these same legislative acts as pure demagoguery and cynical political bribery.
The more cynical interpretation.
Yeah. This perspective argues that politicians like Clodius were intentionally funding violent street gangs and mobs with state resources, using the promise of free food to undermine the traditional, stable authority of the Republic.
So you have two distinct camps in the sources here.
Right, and we do not need to endorse one view over the other, but recognizing this tension is essential. The debate over whether the dole was a civic right or a corrupting bribe defined the political battles of the era.
That tension makes the physical reality of the city incredibly volatile. I mean, think about the physical space of the grain queue in the late Republic.
It would have been intense.
You have tens of thousands of citizens congregating, waiting for their rations. If a shipment from Sicily is late due to weather, or if a conservative politician suggests the rations might be cut to save money, that queue is no longer just a line for food.
No, not at all.
It instantly becomes a highly charged political thermometer. It could spark a full-scale riot in minutes.
It was an environment where the physical survival of the urban population was constantly held hostage by the factionalism of the elite. Politicians were literally playing games with the caloric intake of the city to secure their own careers.
So what does this all mean? How could a functional republic financially or politically survive an environment where ambitious men are constantly outbidding each other with free food from the state treasury? The system seems fundamentally designed to collapse.
Well, the historical reality is that the Republic did not survive it.
Right.
The constant instability, the recurring riots, the weaponization of the food supply, all of these factors eroded the institutions of the Republic. It created a prolonged state of emergency that eventually paved the way for a single ruler to emerge.
Someone who could restore order.
Someone who could promise stability and take absolute permanent control of that food supply.
And that power vacuum brings us to Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and the birth of the imperial machine.
Yes, the turning point.
After the long, exhausting civil wars, Augustus finally consolidates power. But he does not immediately take over the grain supply, does he?
No, initially he left it to the traditional magistrates of the Senate. But in 22 BCE, following another period of severe food shortages and violent riots, the populace essentially demanded his intervention.
They forced his hand.
Pretty much. Augustus reluctantly took personal responsibility for the Cura Annonae. He stepped in where the traditional mechanisms of the Senate had entirely failed.
I want to focus on that word reluctantly, because Augustus was a master of political optics.
Oh, absolutely.
He rarely took a power without making it look like he was doing a burdensome favor for the Republic. By taking control of the grain, he essentially makes himself the sole provider for the city. How does he restructure this broken system to make it functional?
Augustus recognized that the wildly fluctuating numbers of the Republic were unsustainable. His first major act was stabilization. He audited the rolls and firmly reduced the recipient list back down to roughly 200,000 citizens.
Establishing that hard cap we talked about.
Exactly. More importantly, he transformed what had been a chaotic, ad hoc political weapon into a permanent, highly organized and bureaucratic state institution.
He institutionalized it, and he created a specific office for it, right?
Yes. Between the years 9 and 11, Augustus established the permanent office of the Praefectus Annonae. This was a dedicated official whose sole job was to manage the massive logistics of the grain supply.
And who was the first one?
The first man appointed to this post was Gaius Tyrannus.
What is significant about the rank of the Praefectus Annonae? The sources emphasize that this official was drawn from the equestrian rank, not the senatorial rank. Why does that matter?
It is a critical detail of imperial statecraft. By appointing an equestrian, which was the wealthy class just below the senators, Augustus completely bypassed the Senate's traditional authority over state finances and provisions.
Ah, so he cuts the Senate out entirely.
Right. The Praefectus Annonae answered directly and exclusively to the emperor. It ensured that no ambitious senator could ever again use the food supply to build a rival power base. Augustus monopolized the political leverage of the grain.
And that administrative monopoly was accompanied by a profound shift in public messaging. The imperial propaganda inextricably linked the emperor's personal power with the continued survival of the city. We mentioned earlier that the concept of the Annona was deified.
Yeah, the creation of the goddess Annona is a brilliant piece of psychological conditioning. The emperor became the ultimate singular patron of Rome, and the citizens became his massive pool of clients.
How was she depicted?
We see this explicitly on imperial coinage from the era. The goddess Annona is frequently depicted standing alongside a modius filled with wheat, holding a cornucopia, with the prow of a grain ship in the background.
Subtle.
Right. The message was unmistakable. The emperor, and only the emperor, guarantees the city's survival.
That creates a massive psychological shift for the people of Rome. During the Republic, the citizens were active political participants who voted for magistrates based on their proposed grain policies.
They had agency.
But under Augustus, they are transitioned into passive recipients of imperial benevolence. They no longer vote for their food, they simply receive it from the father of the state.
That passive dependency is critical to the transition from republic to empire. It stabilized the city in the short term by permanently removing grain as a point of electoral competition. There were no more riots over which politician would offer more grain because there was only one provider.
Wait, I need to stop you there and push back on this idea of complete stability. Because if you take credit for feeding the city, you also take the blame when they starve, right?
That's a very fair point.
Didn't Augustus just trap himself with this policy? By making the grain an explicit divine imperial guarantee, he put a permanent target on his own back. If there is a bad storm in the Mediterranean, the mob isn't blaming the weather anymore, and they aren't blaming a random magistrate, they are blaming him directly. That seems incredibly fragile.
This raises an important question, and it's the fundamental paradox of the Annona. You have identified the exact trap of autocratic power.
Right.
Once Augustus established the system as an imperial guarantee, it became irreversible. No subsequent emperor could ever revoke it, reduce it, or defund it without facing an immediate legitimate revolt. It became a direct, tangible measure of their divine legitimacy.
So the weather actually became a political crisis.
Exactly. A failed harvest in a distant province, a sunken merchant fleet, or a shipment delayed by adverse winds was no longer perceived as just bad luck or bad weather.
It was a failure of leadership.
It was interpreted by the populace as a failure of the emperor himself. It was a sign that he had lost the favor of the gods, which meant he was no longer fit to rule. The emperor's political survival was tied entirely to the seamless execution of this supply chain.
Which means the logistics cannot fail, under any circumstances.
No margin for error.
To ensure that he never failed this divine duty, Augustus and his successors realized that the Italian peninsula alone could not possibly produce enough food. They had to cast a logistical net across the entire Mediterranean to secure massive, reliable sources of grain. This is where the Cura Annonae begins to reshape the economy of the ancient world.
The geographical shift is stark and heavily documented in our sources. Because the imperial state was importing hundreds of thousands of tons of free or heavily subsidized grain into the capital, local Italian agriculture fundamentally changed.
How so?
Growing common wheat in Italy was simply no longer profitable for landowners. They could not compete with the sheer volume of state-subsidized imports.
So what did the Italian farmers do? They didn't just abandon their fields.
They pivoted. Italian landowners shifted their focus toward high-yield cash crops, primarily vineyards for wine and olive groves for oil.
Stuff they could actually make a profit on.
Yeah, they focused on luxury goods that could be sold for a premium. Consequently, for its daily baseline caloric survival, the city of Rome became almost entirely reliant on the agricultural output of its distant provinces.
The sources highlight three key regions that formed the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Sicily, North Africa, which encompasses modern Tunisia and Libya, and crucially, Egypt. Let's focus on Egypt.
Yes, Egypt is essential to this.
It was annexed by Augustus in 30 BCE, after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, and it seems to have immediately become the crown jewel of this entire operation.
Egypt was vital. The agricultural mechanics of the Nile River made it uniquely productive. The annual inundation of the Nile deposited nutrient-rich silt across the floodplain, allowing for massive, reliable grain yields.
And it wasn't dependent on rain.
Exactly. It was largely insulated from the unpredictable rainfall patterns that plagued the rest of the Mediterranean. Egypt alone quickly grew to supply roughly one-third of Rome's total annual grain needs.
One-third of the supply. That means Egypt was exporting roughly 12 million modi of grain to Rome every single year. But how did the Roman state actually acquire this grain from the Egyptian farmers? Did they purchase it on an open market?
No, the mechanics relied almost entirely on taxation. Grain was exacted from these provinces as a tax in kind, functioning essentially as imperial tribute.
Meaning they just took it.
The provincial farmers were required by law to hand over a significant percentage of their harvest directly to state officials.
That is a highly efficient, closed-loop economic engine for the empire. It drastically reduces the need for the central government to mint and spend physical currency to purchase the grain.
Exactly.
The state demands the physical calories, and the provinces are legally obligated to deliver them to the ports.
The provincial administrators gathered the grain and stockpiled it at major ports like Alexandria in Egypt or Carthage in North Africa. However, gathering the grain at the port is only half the problem,
Right.
because the Roman state did not actually own a massive merchant navy to transport this tax grain across the sea to Italy.
Wait, really? The state is extracting millions of tons of grain as tax? Their entire political survival depends on it reaching Rome, and they don't own the boats to move it? That seems like a massive vulnerability. Who moved the grain?
They relied on the naviculari. These were private, independent ship owners and merchants who were contracted by the state.
Why not just build a state fleet?
The Roman government understood that building, maintaining, and operating a massive state-owned fleet would require an exorbitant capital expenditure. Furthermore, the state did not want to absorb the financial risk of ships sinking in storms.
Ah, so they outsourced the risk to the private sector.
Precisely. It was a delicate balance of public mandate and private enterprise. The state dictated the logistical requirements, but it relied entirely on private merchants to execute the physical transportation.
Let's talk about the physical ships these naviculari used. The sources call them naves honoraria. I imagine these are not sleek, fast military galleys.
Not at all. The naves honoraria were specialized green freighters. They were not built for speed, they were built for maximum cargo capacity and stability.
What did they look like?
They had deep, broad, round-bottomed hulls. They relied almost entirely on large square sails rather than banks of oarsmen, which saved space and reduced the need to carry food for a massive crew.
And how much could they hold?
These freighters were enormous by ancient standards, capable of carrying anywhere from 70 to over 400 metric tons of grain in a single voyage.
But if these are private merchants, what is stopping them from taking their massive ships and running more lucrative private trade routes? Moving state wheat sounds like a heavy, low-margin endeavor. How did the emperors ensure the navicularia dedicated their vessels to the Annona?
The emperors had to offer substantial systemic incentives to secure those private contracts. The sources outlined very specific legal and financial benefits, particularly those enacted under Emperor Claudius in the middle of the 1st century.
Because the system was faltering.
Yeah, Claudius realized the supply chain was too fragile and needed to guarantee merchant participation.
What kind of incentives did Claudius offer?
If a shipowner committed vessels with the capacity of at least 10,000 modi to the state grain trade for a period of several years, they received immense privileges. They were granted sweeping tax exemptions on their other business dealings.
That's huge for a merchant.
And if they were not Roman citizens, participating in this trade could earn them full citizenship. Furthermore, Claudius introduced a revolutionary financial concept, a form of state-backed maritime insurance.
Wait, actual insurance?
He guaranteed that the imperial treasury would personally compensate the merchants if their contracted ships were lost to winter storms.
That is a massive concession. The state is essentially saying, take the risk of sailing in dangerous weather, and if you sink, we will cover your losses. That reveals just how desperate the state was to keep the grain moving. Why was the weather such a critical factor? Couldn't they just sail year-round?
The extreme seasonal vulnerability of maritime trade in antiquity cannot be overstated. The Mediterranean is not a placid lake. Due to the severe autumn and winter storms, ships could generally only sail safely during a specific window.
Which was when?
It was known as the mare apertum, the open sea, which lasted roughly from May to October. Outside of that window, during the mariclosm, the seas were effectively closed. The risk of shipwreck was considered unacceptably high.
So think of the empire functioning like a giant mechanical lung. For 6 months during the summer, the Mediterranean takes one massive, continuous, breath-inhaling thousands of these heavy ships from Alexandria and Carthage, drawing them toward the Italian coast. That's a great image.
And for the next 6 months of winter, the sea is empty, and Rome just has to hold its breath and survive on whatever grain managed to reach the warehouses.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. The entire system operated on this massive, concentrated seasonal pulse. Millions of tons of grain had to arrive within a very narrow time frame.
How long did a trip take?
A standard voyage from Alexandria to Rome took 10 to 14 days under favorable wind conditions. These thousands of sail-driven freighters were constantly racing against the calendar, attempting to complete as many round trips as possible before the autumn storms arrived to shut down the sea lanes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You have this massive fleet of broad-hulled freighters converging on the Italian coast all at once during the summer. But Rome itself is not on the coast.
Right, it's inland.
It is situated 22 miles inland, up the meandering Tiber River. The natural geography of the Italian coastline was completely unsuited for handling maritime traffic of this magnitude.
The geographical bottleneck was severe. The natural port at the mouth of the Tiber, Ostia, suffered from significant limitations. The river constantly deposited silt, making the harbor incredibly shallow.
So the big ships couldn't even pull in.
It simply did not have the water draft necessary to accommodate the massive, fully loaded names honoraria arriving from Egypt. Many of these large freighters had to anchor offshore, and the grain was slowly and dangerously offloaded onto smaller boats just to bring it to the docks.
So the emperors are bringing in unprecedented volumes of grain, but they don't possess the physical infrastructure to actually receive it. The natural environment is actively working against them. How do they solve a geographical bottleneck of that scale?
Well, when the natural environment failed to meet the needs of the Annona, the emperors simply reshaped the coastline through sheer engineering and resources.
Just built a new port.
Emperor Claudius initiated the construction of a massive artificial deep-water harbor called Portus in the year 42. It was an undertaking of staggering proportions, utilizing hydraulic concrete that could cure underwater to build massive protective breakwaters.
And even that wasn't enough, right? The sources mention a major expansion later on.
Correct. The volume of trade continued to grow, and the initial harbor proved insufficient. Emperor Trajan launched a massive expansion of Portus between the years 103 and 113.
What is he at?
The centerpiece of Trajan's expansion was an enormous, deeply excavated hexagonal inner basin. This geometric design maximized the available docking space and provided a perfectly calm, sheltered anchorage capable of accommodating the largest grain ships in the imperial fleet simultaneously.
So Portus was specifically engineered to solve the bottleneck of the Annona. The ships arrive, they finally have a deep water port to dock in. What happens to the grain next? It has to be unloaded and stored immediately, correct?
Yes. Surrounding the docks at Portus and the nearby town of Ostia were the Heraea, the massive state warehouse complexes. The scale of facilities like the Heraea Grandi at Ostia is remarkable.
These weren't just simple storage sheds.
No, these were not simple sheds. They were highly specialized, climate-controlled storage facilities engineered to protect the most valuable commodity in the empire.
Let's delve into the mechanics of that storage. Grain is a living biological organism. If it gets damp, it sprouts or grows mold. If it gets too hot and compressed, it can literally spontaneously combust. How did Roman engineers prevent hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat from rotting in a coastal warehouse?
They utilized specific architectural innovations, most notably the suspensoriae. The storage rooms were built with raised floors.
On modern pallets.
Sort of, but built into the architecture. These floors were supported by small, closely spaced brick pillars, creating an empty void between the ground and the floor holding the grain.
I see. So that void allows air to circulate constantly beneath the massive piles of grain, promoting ventilation and regulating the temperature.
Exactly. The airflow prevented moisture from creeping up from the damp coastal soil, preventing mold. The thick brick walls of the Heraea also provided excellent thermal insulation.
And what about pests?
The raised floors, combined with deeply recessed windows, acted as a physical deterrent against rodents and insect infestations, which could rapidly decimate a stockpile.
From those coastal warehouses at Ostia and Portus, the grain still has to make that final 22-mile journey up the Tiber River into the heart of Rome. How was that accomplished? You can't sail a massive sea freighter up a shallow, winding river.
The grain was transferred from the coastal Harea or directly from the deep sea freighters into specialized river barges known as naves cudicaria.
What did those look like?
These were sturdy, flat-bottomed vessels designed for river transport. But moving them upriver presented a significant physical challenge. They were traveling against the strong, continuous current of the Tiber.
Right, they couldn't use sails effectively on a winding river, and rowing a barge filled with tons of grain against a current seems nearly impossible. How do they move them?
They relied on brute physical force. The barges were towed upriver.
Towed from the shore.
Yes. Ropes were attached to the masts of the naves caudicariae, and teams of men, or sometimes oxen, walked along specialized tow paths constructed on the riverbanks, physically dragging the heavy barges mile after mile against the current. It was grueling, continuous labor.
That is incredible to visualize. A continuous chain of men and animals straining on ropes, hauling the city's food supply up the river day after day.
It was a constant procession.
Now, throughout this entire convoluted transfer process, from the Egyptian port to the sea freighter to the coastal warehouse to the river barge and finally to the city, how did the state ensure that the grain wasn't stolen? Grain is essentially currency. The temptation for merchants or workers to skim a little off the top must have been immense.
The Roman state maintained aggressive, meticulous oversight at every single transfer point to prevent fraud. The bureaucracy was intense. This is where we encounter specialized guild officials known as the mensores fermentari, the official grain measurers.
How did they actually measure it to prevent theft?
The mensores operated with strict, standardized protocols. When grain was transferred, it was poured into an official bronze modius measure. The measure would then use a specialized, perfectly straight ruler called a rutellum to strike the top of the vessel, perfectly leveling off the grain.
Oh, to make sure there wasn't a mound on top.
This ensured that every single measure was exact to the grain. There could be no heaping measures and no partially filled measures.
It is a physical anti-fraud mechanism.
Exactly. Every single shipment, every transfer was tracked, measured, and documented by clerks answering to the Praefectus Annonae.
A mountain of paperwork.
The administration maintained exhaustive ledgers detailing the origin, volume, and destination of every sack. It was a highly formalized, heavily monitored supply chain designed to ensure that the emperor's grain reached the city intact.
So the state manages this massive influx during the summer sailing window, and they track it all the way into the city warehouses. But let me pose this to the listener. You have thousands of tons of grain arriving at once. How do you stop it from rotting before it gets to the citizens? The warehouses inside Rome itself must have been staggering in size to act as that buffer.
They were. The state actively maintained enough reserves in the urban Harea complexes to feed the entire city for weeks and often months at a time.
Just sitting in storage.
By stockpiling the grain in these highly secure facilities, the Roman bureaucracy successfully created an artificial buffer against the chaotic natural environment. They smoothed out the massive seasonal spikes in supply, ensuring a steady, reliable distribution of calories year-round, regardless of what the weather was doing in the Mediterranean.
Okay, so the raw grain has finally reached the urban warehouses safely. The logistical journey across the sea is over. But the process of feeding the citizens is not, because the state was distributing raw, unground wheat. You cannot eat raw wheat.
Right, it's not a finished product yet.
The final step of the Annona required a massive, daily urban processing network. Let's walk through what actually happened on distribution day.
The distribution was highly organized to prevent chaos. The eligible 200,000 citizens received tesserae, which were small wooden or lead tokens that served as their official claim tickets.
Like a ration card.
Exactly. The state designated specific days and specific architectural locations, most notably the Porticus Minutia, for the distribution.
So, a citizen takes his tessera, goes to the Porticus Minutia, and collects his 35 kilograms of raw wheat. But Rome's poorer citizens mostly lived in insulae, which were crowded, multi-story, timber-framed apartment buildings.
Well, very flammable.
Right. They did not have ovens in these apartments because the fire risk was too high, and they certainly did not have the physical space or the heavy stone equipment required to mill 35 kilograms of grain into flour. So what did a citizen do with this heavy sack of wheat?
That is the crucial social reality of the dole. Receiving the state grain was a multi-step chore. The citizen had to transport that heavy grain through the crowded streets to public water mills.
Where were those?
The major concentration of these mills was located on the slopes of the Janiculum Hill, where engineers utilized the powerful water flow from the city's aqueducts to drive the heavy millstone.
Yes. So once they waited in line at the mill and paid to have the grain ground into flour, they still had to bake it.
Correct. They would then carry the flour to public bakeries known as pastrina, where it would finally be kneaded and baked into edible loaves of bread.
This highlights an important distinction. The Annona was not a luxury handout. You didn't just show up and receive a hot meal.
Far from it.
It was a basic survival mechanism that demanded significant time, physical labor, and coordination from the citizens just to turn their raw state ration into food their family could actually eat. It was exhausting work.
It was, and it highlights a significant technological shift that occurred to make this possible. In the early Republic, milling was done at home using small hand querns or by animal-driven rotary mills. But as the population swelled, that was no longer efficient.
They had to industrialize it.
The transition to massive aqueduct-powered hydraulic water mills on the Janiculum allowed for the industrial-scale processing required to feed the urban poor. It was a centralization of infrastructure.
If we look at this evolution over the centuries, we see a fascinating pattern. The state gradually absorbs more and more of this processing burden. The emperors start adding to the dole to keep the populace content.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is a critical observation. The Annona did not remain static, it expanded. In the year 203, Emperor Septimius Severus fundamentally altered the distribution.
What did he do?
He added regular state rations of olive oil, wine, and pork to the standard wheat allotment.
And later, they even take over the baking process, don't they?
Yes. By the 270s, under Emperor Aurelian, the state shifted the primary dole entirely away from raw wheat to finished baked loaves of bread. The state effectively absorbed the milling and baking processes entirely.
That reflects an incredibly deep dependency between the populace and the imperial administration. The citizens went from receiving subsidized raw materials to receiving fully prepared meals from the emperor.
It was the ultimate manifestation of the patron-client relationship we discussed earlier. The state took over every step of the caloric process.
I want to circle back to the additions made by Septimius Severus, specifically the inclusion of olive oil. That policy decision left behind one of the most astonishing physical artifacts of the Annona system, one that you can still visit in Rome today. Let's talk about the logistics of olive oil and how it created a mountain.
The mechanics of the imperial olive oil trade created a very unique and massive logistical challenge. The vast majority of this state-subsidized olive oil arrived from the province of Baetica, which is located in modern-day southern Spain.
Okay, so more long-distance shipping.
Right. And the oil was transported by sea in large, heavy, spherical clay vessels known as amphorae.
So millions of these heavy clay amphorae full of Spanish oil are arriving at the docks at Ostia, being transported up the river, and arriving at the massive state warehouses in Rome, like the Horea Galbae. What happens then?
When these massive amphorae arrived at the urban warehouses, the oil was carefully decanted into much smaller, city-friendly containers that could be easily distributed to the citizens. But this created an immediate problem.
What do you do with the original massive amphorae from Spain?
Exactly.
Why couldn't they just reuse them, wash them out, and send them back to Spain to be refilled?
It was practically and economically impossible. The amphorae were made of porous terracotta clay. The oil seeped into the walls of the vessel during the voyage.
Oh, so they absorbed the oil.
Once emptied, the clay would quickly go rancid, producing a foul odor and rendering the vessel useless for storing fresh food. Furthermore, these amphorae were incredibly heavy and bulky. Loading empty, heavy clay pots onto a ship and sailing them all the way back to Spain simply to be refilled made absolutely no economic sense. The shipping capacity was too valuable.
So they were essentially ancient single-use packaging. But we're talking about millions of massive clay pots. You can't just leave them in the streets. How did the Roman bureaucracy handle this massive accumulation of waste?
The Roman solution was a highly organized, state-managed landfill located just south of the Aventine Hill near the river port. Over the course of centuries, millions of these broken amphorae were systematically layered, sorted, and stacked by state workers to create a massive structure known today as Monte Testaccio.
Monte Testaccio is a completely artificial hill made entirely of broken pottery. It covers an area of over 2 hectares and stands roughly 35 meters high. It is a literal mountain of trash.
It is.
But it's not just a chaotic dump, is it?
No, it is a marvel of bureaucratic organization. The shards were not just thrown into a pile, they were systematically broken down, neatly stacked in terraced layers, and routinely sprinkled with lime powder.
What was the lime for?
The lime neutralized the smell of the rancid oil and acted as a binding agent, stabilizing the growing hill and preventing it from collapsing.
It stands today as a physical, towering monument to the sheer scale of Roman consumption. But it is also a treasure trove of data, isn't it? What do archaeologists actually find when they examine the shards on Monte Testaccio?
The archaeological value of Monte Testaccio is unparalleled. The shards of these amphora often contain painted inscriptions called titoli picti.
Like shipping labels.
These inscriptions act as complete shipping labels. They detail the exact weight of the empty vessel, the exact weight of the oil it contained, the name of the merchant who exported it, the province it came from, and the precise consular date of its arrival.
So Monte Testaccio is quite literally a layered physical spreadsheet of imperial supply cycles spanning generations. The officials of the Annona meticulously documented every shipment, and those records are perfectly preserved in the layers of the landfill.
Exactly. It provides us with highly detailed data on the economic rhythms of the empire.
Think about what this reflects regarding the sheer inflexibility of the Cura Annonae. The state was so heavily committed to moving vast volumes of oil and grain, and the logistical momentum was so unstoppable that dedicating valuable urban land and continuous labor to building a literal mountain of trash was the most efficient logistical choice available to them.
It was a highly pragmatic, engineered solution to a waste management problem generated entirely by the unprecedented scale of the Annona.
This mountain of pottery is a physical manifestation of a system that some ancient commentators argued was burying Roman civic virtue under a mountain of free goods. This brings us to the broader social and economic fallout of the Cura Annonae. Let's examine the most famous critique of this system.
The most enduring critique comes from the Roman satirical poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century. He observed the populace and coined the famous phrase, panem et circenses.
Which translates to bread and circuses.
Right.
It is a phrase we still use today to describe a population distracted by superficial entertainment and free handouts. What was Juvenal's specific grievance?
Juvenal lamented the loss of political agency. He argued that the Roman populace, a people who during the Republic had commanded legions, fiercely debated laws, and held supreme political power, had surrendered their civic duties.
They gave it all up.
He believed they now only anxiously desired two things from their emperor: free food and violent public entertainment in the arenas.
It is a harsh moral critique of dependency. He is suggesting that the dole completely eroded the work ethic, the independence, and the political agency of the Roman citizens. They traded their freedom for a full stomach.
That was his argument, yes.
But we need to look past the satire. The economic reality of the Annona goes far beyond Juvenal's moral critiques. The system fundamentally distorted the entire Mediterranean market, didn't it?
It caused massive economic distortions. At its height, the administration and procurement of the Annona consumed up to 1/3 of the total imperial budget. It was a staggering financial commitment.
A third of the budget just on food.
Because the state subsidized or gave away so much grain, it artificially depressed prices, which completely disincentivized local Italian farming, leading to a long-term agricultural decline in the empire's traditional heartland.
And it also placed an immense, unyielding burden on the provinces.
Absolutely. The system relied heavily on coerced provincial tribute. Provinces like Egypt and North Africa were forced into vast agricultural monocultures.
Just growing grain endlessly.
They were required to dedicate their most fertile land to growing wheat and to send vast percentages of their yields to Rome, often regardless of whether the local provincial populations were facing food shortages themselves. The capital was fed at the expense of the periphery.
The fatal flaw of this entire sprawling setup was its absolute reliance on those distant provinces and the fragile shipping lanes connecting them. The collapse of the system illustrates this perfectly. How did the Annona finally break down?
The vulnerability was always geography. In the 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire weakened, the Vandals crossed the Mediterranean and captured the province of North Africa in the year 439.
Taking Carthage.
They seized Carthage and the rich grain fields that supplied Rome.
So the Western Roman Empire suddenly lost a massive portion of its guaranteed tax-free grain supply. The closed-loop engine was broken.
The impact was immediate and devastating. Without the guaranteed influx of the Annona, Rome could not afford to buy enough food on the open market. The result was rapid, catastrophic urban depopulation.
People just left.
Citizens fled the city to the countryside simply to find food. The massive infrastructure of the Huria and the bakeries collapsed because the city could simply no longer sustain its numbers.
Returning to Juvenal's critique of the idle mob, we need to evaluate that carefully. Was the Roman populace truly just sitting around eating free bread and watching gladiator games?
While Juvenal's critique is famous, modern scholarship provides much more balanced view. Many economic historians argue that the free grain was not a luxury for an idle mob, but an absolute economic necessity to sustain the massive urban workforce required by the capital.
Right. Someone had to actually build and maintain this massive city.
Exactly. These citizens were the artisans, the laborers, the dock workers, the builders who constructed the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the aqueducts. They worked incredibly hard.
But they couldn't afford to eat.
Their wages were low, and they could not afford the volatile, highly speculative free market prices of imported food. The Annona effectively functioned as a state subsidy for the labor pool that made the imperial capital function. Without it, the workforce would have starved, and the city would have ground to a halt.
The economic trap here is fascinating. The Annona created an entirely artificial environment. By importing hundreds of thousands of tons of food using the wealth of an empire, Rome grew exponentially.
Unnaturally large?
It expanded far beyond the natural carrying capacity of its local geography. The city's immense size was entirely dependent on a state-run, intercontinental supply chain, rather than the resources of its immediate hinterland.
What's fascinating here is the profound irony of the Cura Annonae. The system was designed, refined, and constantly expanded by successive emperors, specifically to stabilize the empire and prevent riots in the capital.
Right.
Yet, by creating this massive dependency, they made the capital incredibly fragile. A single disruption in the Egyptian or African shipping lanes, whether from a bad storm, a pirate raid, or a foreign invasion like the Vandals, meant immediate starvation for 1 million people. The relentless pursuit of political stability created extreme long-term logistical vulnerability.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, looking at the long-term impact of this system. The Cura Annonae essentially terraformed the Mediterranean basin.
In a very literal sense.
Because the imperial state demanded that 1 million mouths in the city of Rome be fed every single day, the environment of the provinces had to be altered to meet that demand. Vast, ancient forests in North Africa and Sicily were systematically cleared to make way for massive wheat monocultures.
Completely altering the landscape.
This relentless agricultural exploitation, sustained over centuries, permanently altered the soil composition and the microclimates of those regions, leading to severe topsoil erosion. Long after the Roman ships stopped sailing, long after the Huria crumbled into ruins, and long after the emperors were gone, the landscape remained changed. The pursuit of political stability in one single city physically changed the ecology of an entire continent. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.